The last topic of slots in Vue components is something called scoped slots. For example, if your client says, can you design a component called student list that accepts list as a property, and this component can show all the students in this list. And here is the list. As you can see in the list, there are 3 students, and every student has ID and name. And you're like, this is easy. I have done a very similar project on blog posts. It's very similar. What we can do is, in the template, we're going to define a div. We use this div to hold a unordered list, so ul. And here I will close it. Inside ul, we're going to have multiple li. Okay. For the li, I'm going to use v-4. So student in list, this time it's called list. It is always recommended to use key here. Student.id. Okay, so we're going to use student.id for our key. Now inside this li, in this case, we simply just print this student. Student.name. If we have more properties, we can also print, for example, age or birthday, so on and so forth. Okay. Then in the parent component, I'm going to use this new tag called student list. And here we're going to closing it. Next, don't forget to pass this list from parent to child. Since we have a list as a prop, here we're going to use list, then it's equal to list. I'm sorry, this is a little confusing. This list here refers to the list in the parent, and this list here refers to the prop in the component. All right, so right click, I'm going to view in browser. 3 students' names, student.name as the first li, second li, and third li. So everything looks good. Now our dear client, dear in quotes, says, I have a new feature request. A new requirement is that, can you find a student whose name is Harry and make this name color red? Because for now, we're using v-4 to print every student's name in the same color. But the requirement is we are going to find Harry and make this name red because Harry is special, right? And another constraint is you can only do it in this parent component. I'll explain why we have this constraint later on. But for now, I'm going to collapse this component. So you can think of this as a black box. The parent component, we're only using student list component and passing this list to the list prop. And you're like, well, that's simple. All right, first I'm going to define a CSS to make the text red. So I have already done this. If I open this, we have a class called cursed, and this color will be red. Any text with this CSS class will be red. All right, next, what I'm going to do is, now this is the content. So in the content of this tag, I'm going to tell if a student's name is equal to Harry or not. I'm going to use v-if, if you still remember v-if. So first, I'm going to type a span, and here is v-if student.name equal Harry. So if the v-if is true, this span will be shown, and we're going to add a class to this span. It's called cursed. And of course, inside this span, we're going to write student.name. So that's the first span. Then else, that's the second span, v-else. Else. So that means if student.name is not equal to Harry, I'm just going to copy and paste. Up until now, I hope you guys understand this syntax. This is if-else. Only one of them will be printed, really based on the true or false here. Okay, if it's true, then only this will be printed. So we have a color equal to red, and otherwise we have just a plain text. Will this work? Well, unfortunately, this won't work because the parent component has no access to this individual student. Only this component student list, let me expand this. Only this component student list has access to student. In other words, you can use student.name here in this child component, but you can never use student.name in the parent component because parent component has no access to the individual item in this array. Then what should we do? The answer is we should modify the component code to make sure that the student is also available to the parent, okay? And we can do that using slot. And in this case, we're using scoped slot. So here's how I change my component code. So after I've done that, then the parent will have access to student. I'm going to scroll down here. Here we're printing student.name directly. I'm going to cut, and inside this li, I'm going to define a scoped slot. So here is syntax. Slot stu equal to student. And down here, I'm going to close it, slot, and then paste. So this is the change that I made. Now before, we only have student.name, and now we're including this within slot. And this slot here is called a scoped slot. And in this slot, we're assigning student. Now this student here is referring to a student in the list to an attribute called stu. And we can use this stu in the parent. Okay, so let's scroll up and we're going to modify the parent. Now once we define this scoped slot, and here's how we use it. Before this, we're going to define a template. And we're going to move this, everything here, into template. And then properly format it. So this is the template. And this template is directly under student list tag. In this template, we're going to retrieve this scoped slot. And here is the syntax. v-slot, we're going to use this directive, default equal to slot props. Okay, so this is syntax. Make sure you remember this. Now, once we have this slot props, we're going to access a student using this syntax. Slot props dot stu dot name. Now, do you remember stu is a scoped slot we defined here? So this is how we retrieve it. So we're using slot props dot stu dot name. Okay. We also need to change this to slot props dot stu. Okay, so right click, view in browser. As you can see, the student whose name is Harry will be in red now. Let's do a summary here. In this example, the parent component wants to access student's name to tell if the name is equal to Harry or not. If so, we're going to make this name red, otherwise using default color. However, student is only accessible within the child component, in this case, student list. To make this object also available in parent component, so the parent component can use this if to tell if it's Harry or not, we have to create a scoped slot in the child component using this syntax. Now here, we only create one scoped slot. And we bind this student, so this is student object, to stu. And we call this stu a slot prop. Then once we have done this, then how does the parent component have access to this stu? Here is the syntax. v-slot default equal to slot props. This slot props is the object that has all the slot props. Now in this case, we want to have one prop, which is stu. So we're using slot props. Now this is the object that has all the props, dot one particular prop, then dot name. And here's how we print it. Now this name can be anything. For example, if I change it to, I don't know, just call it Bing. Okay, will this work? This will also work because this syntax will just return an object that has all the props. I don't really care what the name is. But once I change it to Bing, I also have to change it to bing.stu, bing.stu. Okay, so right click, view in browser. As you can see, there's no difference. So really, this one returns an object that contains all the slot props, and you can specify which one you are interested in. And you can define as many slot props as you want in here. Now in this case, there's only one. View slots can be a little confusing for most beginners. At least it was for me when I first learned Vue. So I made this slide to compare 3 slots: View slot, a View name slot, and View scope slot. And they correspond to demo 10, demo 11, and demo 12. But I put them on the same picture. So let's talk about this simple slot. In Vue, a slot refers to the content we put in between an open and closing HTML tag. For example, in this case, this is a compile error, is the slot content of this HTML tag, open and close. In the first example, to receive the slot content in this child component, in the child component, we define a slot tag, so slot and slot. And this is an error message, is the default message. Now, if there's no content, like the last one here, alert box, then this default message will be shown. If there is some content, then this content will replace this entire slot. Next, let's talk about name slot. There are times when it is useful to have multiple slots in one component, like in this case. So in this case, there are 3 slots. So that means when we use this component, we have to pass 3 contents. A content for header, a content for this main area, and a content for footer. Then how do we differentiate them? That's why we give a slot a name. So the name of the first slot is header. That's why I call it named slot, right? And then this is footer. If you do not give a name to a slot, then there is also a name. The name is default, okay? So how do we pass content from parent to child? Everything inside template, in this case, everything inside template, there is a p header content. We replace this slot, name equal to header. And the same thing here. So everything within this template will be passed to this slot. And everything else without any template wrapping it, like in this case, the 2p's, these 2p's here, will go all the way to this default slot. In the last example is the scope slot. In the component, we bind student object to this STU. Okay, so this is an attribute of this slot tag. So attributes bound to a slot element in a child component are called slot props. Then how do we retrieve this slot prop in parent component? So in parent component, we're using v-slot. As you can see here, we're interested in a slot named default. Now, if you remember that in name slot, any slot without an explicit name is called default. Since here we only have one slot and we don't have a name, so this default here is referring to this slot. So in this case, you don't have to write this default. You can simply write v-slot equal to slot props. Now, this slot props represents an object, and in this object there are many slot props. In this case, we only have one. It's called STU. So this is how we retrieve STU from this aggregate. You can call it aggregate object, right? Because this object has many, many props. So slotprops.stu.name. So that's how we use slot props to retrieve a student information. What's happened here is this entire template, everything within this template, in this case, the 2 spans, will replace this student name. So in the original case, we simply just print every student name. But in here, we're going to do a if else. If name is equal to Harry, make it red. Otherwise, print as is. I hope this slide will help you understand what a Vue slot is. Let's come back to demo 12, scoped slots. In this example, the parent component is trying to determine if a student's name is equal to Harry or not. If so, we're going to use CSS class equal to cursed to make this name red. Otherwise, we'll simply just print this name as is. Since the parent component needs access to student object, we need to use scoped slots to make this student object available in parent component, because without scoped slots, this student object will only be visible or available in this component, this child component, student-list. So everything works fine, but I want to go deeper into this question. I'm sure many students will have the same question is, why bother? If we move the logic of determining a student name equal to Harry or not from parent component into child component, then we no longer need scoped slots. So here is what I mean. I'm going to cut the two spans, v-if, v-else, and paste them in child. Of course, I'm going to properly indent this code. Now, the parent component no longer needs access to student object since we moved all the logics from here to here. I'm going to delete this. v-4 for every student. If student.name is equal to Harry, we're going to print student.name. Else, student.name. Okay, format. Since we're not using scope slots, I can safely delete line 16. So look at line 15. What we're doing here is we're passing this list to the component prop. So this list is prepared in this view instance, and this list here is the prop of this component. Okay, so right-click, view in browser. As you can see, everything is still the same. Harry is still marked as red. So really, why bother? If we can move all the logic from the parent to child, we no longer need scope slots. But why do we still need scope slots? There are two reasons. Here, I have changed it back to where we were. So in the parent component, we're doing the comparison, and the only responsibility of this child component is just to list student as is. So the first reason is we're going to talk about whose responsibility it is. So for example, in this case, the only responsibility of this child component, this student list, is just to print student as is. If your app, now you can think about this as an app, if your app has some custom requirements, some new requirement, actual requirement, then you have to put the logic in here and don't pollute this student list. What do I mean by pollute? So let me show you a slide. Well, in this picture, let's assume this is our app. Our app's name is Hogwarts app. Now we have this new filter request is go ahead and print student, and for each student, if name is equal to Harry, we're going to make it red. We're putting all the logic, the if-else logic in this parent. Let's say we have a different app. It is TCU app. We also have this need to use this component called student list. So the two apps, they are using the same component, student list. But in TCU, we don't have this requirement of marking a student whose name is Harry red, right? We're only going to use student list. And now we have a new filter request for TCU app is we're going to make every student's name purple. We're going to have this logic of making every student purple in here. And that should not pollute this student list because the only responsibility of student list is to print student as is. Let's say UNT also are interested in the same component. So by using student list, UNT only want to print all the students. If UNT has some more or extra requirement, they can add their logic here, and they will not pollute this student list. So that's why in this example, we don't recommend put the logic of telling a student name equal to Harry in the child. We should put it in the parent. Let me talk about the second reason of using scope slots. Well, in this case, we developed both parent and child components. So this student list is developed in-house in my own company, right? What if this student list is from a third party? So I'm going to collapse. So that means this is a black box to me. I download this component library from somewhere, and we're only developing the parent. The original student list will only show student name as is. And since this is a third-party component, I didn't develop it, right? I don't really know how to modify the internal workers. Maybe I don't want to do that. What I want to do is I want to slightly modify it. So by using scope slots, this third-party component gives the user, in this case developers, a chance to customize it. For example, in this case, the default behavior of this component is print student name as is. But if I'm using it, I want to print, Harry as red. Can I do it? No problem. And we can do this through scope slots. So when you develop a component, I want to make it public, okay? In other words, you're developing this third-party component and want more users to use it. I highly recommend you use scope slots to give your users a chance to change, to customize. So next, let me show you a component library called Element UI and how Element UI is using this concept of scoped slots. And that will support my second reason.